The first thing Darrow Voss noticed about the ship was that it was bleeding. Not metaphorically. There was actual fluid, iridescent, almost violet, seeping from a fracture along the ventral hull, pooling in the red Mojave dust like something alive trying to crawl away from the wreck. The sun was 2 hours from setting and the desert smelled of sage and hot iron, and Darrow stood at the edge of the exclusion perimeter the military had strung up in a 6-kilometer radius and thought, nobody built that. No human hand touched that hull plating. The angles were wrong in a way that made your eyes slide off if you stared too long, like your brain refused to commit the geometry to memory. He'd driven 11 hours from the depot at Albuquerque on a fuel cell that kept threatening to quit. He had a toolkit in the truck bed, a thermos of bad coffee, and a Department of Interstellar Technical Assessment contractor badge that was 6 months from expiring. He did not have authorization to be inside the perimeter. He had talked his way past the checkpoint using the badge and the specific tone of voice, flat, mildly annoyed, carrying a clipboard that made military personnel assume someone else had already approved your presence. Darrow was 34 years old, 6 feet of lean and unremarkable, with hands that were permanently stained with lubricant no matter how hard he scrubbed. He had grown up in a town in New Mexico where the biggest employer was an ore processing plant, and he had learned to fix things there: motors, compressors, the town's single traffic signal, because things broke constantly and no one else was going to fix them. He had a certificate in xenotechnical repair from a correspondence program that had been running for exactly 3 years, which was how long it had been since the Reach made first contact, and humanity had spent 18 months in a kind of stunned collective silence before deciding they needed people who could work on alien machinery. The Reach were not the species that had crashed in the Mojave. That was the thing nobody in the briefing tent seemed entirely comfortable saying out loud. He found the lead engineer, a Colonel Westbrook, arguing with 2 scientists near a triage station 30 meters from the ship's primary access seam. The seam was partly open, peeled back like a tin lid, and there were bodies, or things shaped roughly like bodies, laid out on silver thermal blankets nearby. Most were not moving. "You're Voss," Westbrook said, not looking up from the tablet he was scrolling through. "That's what my badge says. You're the Xenotech contractor from the Albuquerque depot. You're reading my file right now." Westbrook looked up. He had the face of a man who had been awake for 30 hours and was operating on the understanding that he would be awake for 30 more. "We have 1 survivor, maybe. She's in a sealed compartment we cannot open without risk of catastrophic depressurization of whatever atmosphere she's maintaining in there. The ship's propulsion core is damaged. We don't know if it's stable. We don't know what it runs on. We have had 4 DITA contractors come through here in the past 9 hours, and none of them could get past the outer panel array." "What species?" Darrow asked. Westbrook handed him a photo. Darrow looked at it for a long time. It was hard to say she was humanoid exactly, because that word implied that human was the baseline and she was an approximation. She was something else entirely, and the human shape was just the shared outcome of similar evolutionary pressures on a similar planetary gravity. Tall, nearly 7 feet in the image, with a build that suggested denser muscle structure under a skin that was a deep charcoal gray, almost black in low light, patterned with very faint bioluminescent markings along the jaw and the back of the hands that looked less like decoration and more like circuitry. Her eyes in the image were closed. Her face in repose was severe, almost architectural, with a brow ridge that caught shadow and a jaw set like stone. She was wearing what appeared to be flight armor, partially disassembled, like she had been trying to remove it when she lost consciousness. The breastplate bore a symbol that the analysts had already identified, a stylized sigil of the Vethani sovereignty, one of 7 major political entities in the Reach's extended contact network. Not the Reach, not allied with the Reach. The intelligence assessment on the Vethani ran to about 200 pages of educated guessing, and the summary was aristocratic, isolationist, technologically advanced well beyond current human capability, and deeply invested in a caste system that apparently made European feudalism look egalitarian. The Vethani princess, because the sigil meant royalty, apparently, which was its own entire problem, was sealed inside a failing ship in the Mojave Desert, and nobody could get the door open. Darrow handed the photo back. "Show me the panel array." The outer hull was warm to the touch, which should have been impossible given how long it had been sitting in the desert sun. The thermal signature should have equalized hours ago. It hadn't. The hull maintained its own temperature, slightly warmer than ambient, which meant either the hull had a passive thermal regulation system or there was still something active inside. Darrow pressed his palm flat against the surface and felt, very faintly, a vibration at the edge of perception. Not mechanical. More like a heartbeat. The panel array was a clustered grid of hexagonal nodes, each about the size of his fist, arranged in a pattern that radiated outward from the primary access seam. The previous 4 contractors had tried to interface with the nodes directly. He could see the scorch marks where one of them had attempted a direct electrical input, which suggested they had misread the array as a power-based lock system. Darrow sat cross-legged in the dust in front of it, drank the last of his bad coffee, and looked at the nodes for a long time without touching them. The thing about alien technology, the thing the correspondence course had hammered into him for 18 months, was that you couldn't approach it as a human engineer. Human engineering started with function and built outward to form. You designed a lock because you needed to prevent entry, and the mechanism existed to serve that function. Alien engineering and the contact cultures studied so far tended to work the other direction. Form generated function. The shape of the thing told you what it did. The aesthetic was the schematic. He looked at the hexagonal pattern, looked at the way the nodes related to each other, looked at the spacing, the slight offset in the 3rd and 7th rings, the way the whole array had a slight asymmetry that could have been damaged but felt deliberate. It looked, he thought, like a conversation. Not a lock, a dialogue protocol. You weren't meant to force it open. You were meant to respond to it. He pulled on a pair of insulated contact gloves and pressed 2 fingertips to the node at the center of the array. It pulsed once, warm and bright, and then went still. He waited. The nodes around it lit in sequence, moving outward from his touch point in a wave. Then they stopped, all of them pulsing at a slightly different frequency than they had before. He watched the pattern, watched the spacing between pulses, and then very slowly he began tapping, node to node, answering the rhythm the array was putting out. He was not a musician. He had never studied xenolinguistics. What he had was 11 years of diagnosing failing machinery by sound and feel, of learning to hear what a broken system was trying to tell you, and the fundamental conviction, one the course had reinforced, and that working on reach-adjacent tech for 3 years had hammered into bone, that a thing that wanted to stay closed told you exactly how it wanted to be opened if you were quiet enough to listen. It took 40 minutes. The access seam opened with a sound like a long exhaled breath. The air inside was different, denser slightly, smelled of something he had no reference for, not chemical, not biological exactly, more like the smell of a thunderstorm right before it hits, that ozone and earth combination that meant something charged was about to discharge. The interior lighting was low and amber, which he thought might be distress lighting. There were strips of brighter illumination that had gone dark. He moved carefully. The floor was slightly concave, which took adjustment. The geometry of the interior was built for someone taller. The corridors had high vaulted ceilings, and the handholds along the walls were spaced for a longer arm span. He found her by following the sound. She was talking. Not to him. She either didn't know he was there or didn't have the bandwidth to care. She was sitting with her back against what looked like an engineering console, her long legs stretched out across the floor, and she was speaking in a low, continuous murmur that he didn't understand a word of. The bioluminescent markings along her jaw and hands were dim, flickering erratically, the way a fluorescent bulb flickered when the ballast was going. That meant something. Biological distress indicator, probably. Her flight armor was half removed, breastplate off, one greave still attached, pauldron dangling from one shoulder by a single connection point. She looked in that moment like someone who had been trying very hard to hold everything together and had run out of the energy to keep pretending she wasn't losing. Darrow recognized that look. He had worn it himself at the ore processing plant during the 6-month period when 3 of the 4 primary compressors were down, and the whole operation was running on the one unit he'd managed to keep alive with parts cannibalized from the other 3, and a level of personal denial that his doctor later said had probably taken 2 years off his life. He did not announce himself dramatically. He sat down on the floor of the corridor about 4 meters away from her and said, "I'm a mechanic. I'm going to need to look at your engine." She stopped talking, her head turned. Her eyes large, a pale amber that was almost gold, with a horizontal pupil like a goat's, which was startling up close, fixed on him. He held up both hands, palms out, empty, no weapons, not a threat. She said something in her language. He shook his head. "I don't speak that. I don't know what you're saying, but I can see that your propulsion core has a coolant fracture on the ventral hull, the violet fluid pooling under your ship, and your power distribution array is failing because the primary node cluster is trying to compensate for the loss of the tertiary loop, which means you have maybe 6 hours before the core starts venting in a way that will be bad for both of us." She stared at him. "I got that from looking at the panel array outside," he said. The nodes were describing the problem. "It's actually a pretty elegant distress system, better than ours, honestly. We just have a light that says, 'check engine,' and doesn't tell you which engine." She said something again. This time he thought it might be a question. The inflection at the end was different. "My name is Darrow," he said and pointed at his chest. "Darrow." A long pause. Then she said something and pointed at herself. He wasn't going to be able to replicate the sound exactly. There were consonants in it that his mouth wasn't shaped for, but it began with something that sounded, roughly, like rail. He filed it away. "Okay," he said, standing up. "Rail, I need to look at the engine." She led him. That was the surprising part. She had watched him for a full minute after he stood, the way you watched something you hadn't decided about yet, not with hostility exactly, but with the very careful attention of someone who did not have the resources to be wrong. Then she pushed herself upright. She winced when she did, which told him the rib situation he'd suspected from the way she was sitting was real, and led him deeper into the ship. The propulsion core was breathtaking. Not in a comfortable way. In the way that the Grand Canyon was breathtaking. This involuntary intake of air because your brain needed a moment to accept the scale of what it was processing. The core chamber was larger than the exterior dimensions of the ship should have allowed, which meant either his perception of the exterior was wrong or the interior was operating on a different spatial logic, and he wasn't going to spend time on that particular problem right now. The core itself was a contained singularity. He recognized that much from the theoretical materials in the correspondence course, the advanced module on gravitational energy systems that had a 2% completion rate because most students hit page 40 and quietly unsubscribed, surrounded by a lattice of what looked like crystalline conduit. About a third of the lattice had gone dark. One of the primary crystalline columns had a hairline fracture running its full length. Darrow stood in the doorway of the engine room and looked at it and thought, "No one can fix that. It can't be fixed." He stood there for 30 seconds with that thought. Then he told himself to stop being Eccles. It could be fixed. It was just a fracture in a conduit system. The principles were the same as the ore processing plant, the same as any piece of machinery that had taken damage and needed continuity restored. The scale was different. The medium was different. The underlying logic was not. He crouched and opened his toolkit. The next 4 hours were the most technically demanding of his life, and also, in some sideways sense, the most clarifying. Rael stayed. She didn't help, she didn't have the strength for it, and he didn't need her to, but she stayed, sitting on the floor near the chamber entrance, watching everything he did with that same careful, uncategorizing attention. Her bioluminescent markings had stopped flickering. They were dim but steady. He chose to take that as a good sign. He started with the power distribution array, because that was the most immediate failure mode. The primary node cluster was drawing from reserves it wasn't designed to tap, compensating in real time for the loss of the tertiary loop. And if he let it run that way, the reserves would exhaust in roughly 6 hours, and then nothing else would matter. He had to trace the load paths manually. The array had no interface he could read, so he did it by touch and by the temperature differential between nodes, the ones under higher load running fractionally hotter than their neighbors. He had done this exact thing before with human machinery. A failing HVAC system in the depot 3 winters back, when the building management computer had gone offline and he'd had to walk the ductwork by feel, finding blockages by the change in airflow against his palm. It was slower than using instruments. It was also, it turned out, not categorically different across species. Physics was physics. Load distributed or it didn't. Heat built or it dissipated. The materials were different. The principles were not. He identified 2 bypass nodes, small hexagonal components in the lower tier of the array that were designed, he thought, for exactly this kind of contingency, and spent 40 minutes coaxing them into active bypass mode. The coaxing involved a sequence of pressure inputs to the surrounding nodes that he developed by trial and error, and during the trial and error portion of this he talked, because he always talked while he worked. Running commentary, addressed to the machinery. What he was trying. What wasn't working, hypotheses about why. It was a habit he developed alone at the processing plant and had never broken, and it served the same function it always had. Keeping his mind organized, preventing the particular kind of stuck thinking that happened when you got frustrated and started repeating the same failed approach with more force. Rael, sitting on the floor of the chamber entrance, watched him talk to her ship's components. He didn't notice her watching, he was focused. The bypass nodes eventually clicked into active mode with a sound like a key turning in a lock, and the temperature differential across the array began, slowly, to equalize. "There you go," he said, "that's better." He could not fix the fractured crystalline column directly. The material was beyond anything in his kit. What he could do, and what took him the first 90 minutes to figure out, was redirect the load-bearing function of that column through 2 adjacent columns that were intact, by physically rerouting the conduit connections at their base nodes. It was the machinery equivalent of a bridge engineer shoring up a cracked support by redistributing weight to the adjacent pylons. Not elegant. The kind of solution that would make a Vethani engineer weep, probably. But it would hold. The process of rerouting the conduit connections was intricate. The base nodes were designed to accept specific connection geometries, and his human-built connection tools didn't quite fit, too small in the coupling head, wrong thread pitch. He spent 20 minutes fabricating an adapter from 2 components in his kit, using a technique that his instructor in the correspondence course had called catastrophically inadvisable under normal circumstances, and acceptable only when the alternative is worse. He had used it 8 times in the field, and it had worked 7 of those 8 times, which he considered an acceptable ratio. He glanced over at Rael while he was working the adapter. She had her head tilted slightly to the right. Her eyes were tracking his hands with the focused intensity of someone who was trying to reverse engineer a process from observation alone. "Catastrophically inadvisable," he said, holding up the adapter. She didn't understand him, but she looked at the adapter, and then looked at him with an expression that suggested she had arrived at her own independent assessment of the fabrication quality. "I know," he said, Don't judge the toolbox, judge the outcome. He got the conduit connections rerouted. The crystalline columns that had been carrying partial load from the fractured one brightened by about 30%, more than he'd expected, which either meant the redistribution was working better than anticipated, or that the damaged column had been degrading for longer than just the crash and those adjacent columns had been compensating for a while already. The second problem was the coolant fracture. The ship's own repair systems had tried to seal it and partially succeeded. There was a patch of what looked like biomechanical scar tissue over the fracture point, but the seal was incomplete and still weeping. He didn't have anything in his kit that would bond to the hull material. He sat with that for a long time, turning his toolkit over in his mind, running through what he had and what properties he needed, and where those two lists intersected. They didn't intersect, not perfectly, they intersected enough. He thought about the ore processing plant. About the winter, the primary coolant line on compressor 3 had cracked, and they didn't have the right sealant, and the next part's delivery was 6 weeks out. About what he'd done, which was to pull the thermal tape from a maintenance locker, the kind used to wrap hot pipes in human construction, cheap and cheerful, and never meant for serious load-bearing application, and layer it, wet with a sodium silicate solution he'd improvised from the plant's own mineral processing byproduct, over the crack in 12 overlapping bands. It had held for 7 months. He looked at his toolkit. He had thermal tape. He always carried thermal tape. It was the duct tape of thermal management, which meant it lived in every kit he owned as a matter of principle. He had a flask of the coffee he'd finished hours ago, which had sodium content from the mineral-heavy Albuquerque tap water. He had done a rough calculation, sometime in the second hour, that the biomechanical scar tissue the ship had generated over the fracture was doing roughly 60% of the sealing work. He needed to do the other 40%, and he needed to do it with what he had. He looked at Rael. "This is going to look incredibly stupid," he said. She didn't understand him, but something in his tone made one corner of her severe architectural mouth shift, not quite a smile, not quite, but the ghost of the concept. The bioluminescent tracery along her jaw pulsed once, brighter, and then settled back. He thought she understood the tone. She understood the specific register of a person who was about to do something inelegant because it was the best available option. She recognized that register. Probably she had used it herself. He applied the thermal tape in 12 overlapping bands, wet with cold coffee, pressing each layer down carefully against the partial seal the ship had already generated, making sure the edges bonded. The tape would not last forever. It was not rated for gravitational core proximity. He was making it work through sheer overlap, 12 layers of inadequate material adding up to something the fracture couldn't push through cleanly. He sat back and waited. The leak slowed. It didn't stop entirely, but it slowed to a seep that the ship's own repair systems could probably manage over the next few days. Maybe longer if the tape held better than it should. He said to no one in particular, "It's not pretty, but it'll get you home." He went out and told Westbrook the core was stable. Westbrook looked at him the way people always looked at him when he solved a problem, half grateful, half affronted that the solution had been so unimpressive. He went back inside because Rael hadn't moved from her position on the floor, and he wanted to make sure she could. She could stand. She did when he came back, and she was steadier than she'd been before. The bioluminescent markings along her jaw had brightened. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully decode. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't warmth exactly, because he suspected those things read differently across 30 light-years of evolutionary distance. It was something more like the look a person gave a theorem they hadn't expected to prove correct. She spoke, long, measured, with a cadence that felt deliberate, like she was making an effort at clarity for an audience she knew couldn't understand her. He said, "I still don't know what you're saying." She stopped, appeared to consider. Then she crossed to the engineering console, tapped a sequence on a panel, and a holographic display came up, a map of some kind, stellar, with a system highlighted at the far edge that he couldn't place on any map he knew. She pointed at the map, then pointed at herself. "Where you're from," he said. She nodded. He didn't know if she'd learned that gesture, or if the Vethani used the same one, and he decided that was probably going to be a question for the linguists who would descend on this site in enormous numbers once the exclusion perimeter opened. She pointed at him. He said, "Earth, we call it Earth." He thought about trying to point to it on her map and realized he genuinely wasn't sure where it would be. The scale was different. The reference points were different. He spread his hands in a gesture he hoped conveyed, "I don't know how to show you." She looked at that gesture for a moment. Then she did something he did not expect at all. She crossed the remaining distance between them, 4 paces, unhurried, precise, and took his face in both hands. Her hands were large, and the skin was smooth and very warm, and the bioluminescent tracery on the backs of them was inches from his eyes, so close he could see that the patterns were not static but moved, subtly, like slow currents. She looked at him from a distance of about 6 inches. The gold-amber eyes with the horizontal pupils were unsettling, and also very beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when they were completely different from anything you'd seen before. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, held it there for 3 seconds, her eyes closed, his eyes closed. He did not know what it meant in Vethani terms. He knew what it felt like being seen, not assessed, not categorized, seen. As if the gesture was designed to communicate that whatever had happened in the last 4 hours, whatever he was, she had registered him as real and specific and worth the gesture. She stepped back, looked at him again with that expression he couldn't decode. Then she leaned forward and pressed her lips to the corner of his jaw very lightly in a place that wasn't quite a kiss and wasn't quite not one, and she said something. Short. 2 words, maybe 3. The tone was clear even without the translation. It was a declaration. It was a promise. She turned and went back to her console. He stood there for a moment in the amber light of her ship, with the smell of ozone and strange air around him, and the faint warmth of where she'd touched him still registering at a cellular level, and thought about the butterfly. Not the dead one in Bradbury's story, the living one, the one that didn't get crushed. The one that flew. She left at 3:40 hours. The military had not been told she was leaving. She had spent 6 hours in contact with her ship's systems, while the xenolinguists attempted to establish a translation baseline in a prefabricated structure set up outside the perimeter. And at some point during that 6 hours, she had apparently completed enough of the repairs to the secondary systems that the ship could lift. The repair to the coolant fracture, thermal tape, and cold coffee held. Darrow's rerouting of the conduit load held. The gravitational core, which he had not touched and did not understand, and had decided to simply leave alone on the principle that you didn't adjust what wasn't broken, held. At 3:40 hours the ground shook with the sound of the ship's engines engaging. Darrow was sitting outside the perimeter on the hood of his truck, drinking hot coffee from a new thermos he'd bought at the checkpoint commissary, watching the stars. He had not been allowed back inside after the military had taken over the site management around midnight. He was debating whether to drive back to Albuquerque tonight or sleep in the truck bed. The sound of the engines was enormous. Not mechanical exactly. It was more like the sound of a large space rearranging itself, like a mountain deciding to move. The ground vibrated in long, slow waves, and the dust around the exclusion perimeter rose in great curtains, and the lights of the ship, which had been mostly dark, blazed on all at once, amber and violet, and a white so pure it had a temperature. He watched the ship rise. It rose slowly at first, the way something that massive had to rise slowly, and then faster, and then with a speed that stopped making visual sense. It was there, and then it was a point of light among the other points of light, and then it was gone. He sat with his coffee. The desert was very quiet. Westbrook found him about 20 minutes later, walking out from the perimeter with his tablet under his arm, and an expression that suggested he was calculating exactly how much paperwork this was going to generate. "She's gone," Westbrook said. "I can see that. We didn't get a translation. We didn't get any kind of formal contact protocol established. She left without any documentation of." "She'll come back," Darrow said. Westbrook looked at him. "You don't know that." "She told me." "You don't speak her language." Darrow looked at his coffee. "Some things you don't need a translation for." Westbrook made a sound that was not agreement and was not disagreement, and contained about 40 pages of bureaucratic frustration. Then he walked back toward the perimeter. The desert settled back into its nighttime sounds. A coyote somewhere to the north, the cooling tick of the truck's engine, the wind coming down off the mountains with the smell of cold rock and sage. Darrow Voss sat on the hood of his truck and thought about the Vethani sovereignty, which covered, according to the intelligence brief he'd skimmed at the checkpoint, approximately 47 star systems. He thought about the kind of weight that came with being royalty in a civilization that had been spacefaring for what the Reach's historical records suggested was somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. He thought about a woman who had been alone in a failing ship, talking to herself, trying to hold things together, running out of the energy to pretend she wasn't losing. He thought about the forehead press, the gesture that meant, "I have registered you as real." He thought about how small acts had consequences that ran forward through time like cracks through crystal. The butterfly, the dead butterfly, the butterfly that lived, and how you never knew, while you were doing the small act, that it was going to be the hinge everything else turned on. He had fixed the ship with thermal tape and cold coffee. What that fixed he couldn't say. 8 months passed. Darrow did not become famous. He was named in the initial Department of Interstellar Technical Assessment Report as Contractor D. Voss, Xenotech Specialist, Albuquerque Regional Depot, and the report noted that he had achieved unauthorized entry to the alien vessel, stabilized the propulsion core, and facilitated the survivors' recovery. There was a brief formal inquiry about the unauthorized entry, which was closed after 6 weeks when it became clear that without the unauthorized entry, the ship would have vented lethally before morning, and the inquiry itself would have been much more complicated. He was issued a formal citation for initiative under non-standard conditions, which was a government document that essentially said, "You shouldn't have done that, but it worked, so here is a piece of paper." He went back to the depot. He fixed things. He filed his weekly reports with DITA on the technical composition of the Vethani hull material, which he had been asked to document as thoroughly as possible from memory. He filled out the forms carefully, because he was careful about forms, and then he drove home to his apartment in Albuquerque and made dinner, and did not watch the news, because the news coverage of the Mojave site had settled into a mixture of wild speculation and official non-answers that he found actively counterproductive. He thought about Rail. He was honest with himself about that. He thought about her with the specific discipline of someone who recognized that thinking about her was not the same as having information about her, and that he didn't have information, didn't know if she was alive, didn't know if the repair had held long enough to matter, didn't know what her people's reaction would be to her crashing in an alien desert and being repaired by a mechanic with coffee and tape. The site in the Mojave became, in that time, the most studied piece of real estate on Earth. The violet fluid that had pooled in the dust turned out to have properties that 2 separate pharmaceutical companies were already filing patents on, which led to an international incident about the ownership of alien biological material that was still working its way through the UN when the second ship arrived. It did not arrive in the Mojave. It arrived, with no warning and no radar signature, in the parking lot of the Albuquerque depot where Darrow Voss worked. It was not alone. There were 4 other ships positioned at high altitude above the city, visible in the early morning light as geometric shadows that moved against the clouds in ways that clouds didn't move. The city's emergency systems went active. There were 3 minutes of the particular kind of panic that descended on population centers when something incomprehensible happened directly overhead, and nobody had a protocol for it. Then the first ship's access seam opened. Rail came out. She was in different armor, full formal armor, the kind you wore for occasions rather than combat, intricately worked in dark metal with gold amber inlay that matched her eyes. She was taller than Darrow remembered somehow, or maybe she just occupied more space. She had 4 attendants with her, each of them 6 feet of quiet competence, and they stopped at the base of the ship's ramp and stayed there while she walked forward alone. The depot manager, a man named Chavez who had a blood pressure problem and a strong personal preference for days when nothing unusual happened, was standing in the parking lot because he had been checking on a delivery. He had his clipboard. He was staring. Rail walked up to him, looked at him, looked around the parking lot and said one word in Vethani. Chavez later reported that somehow, without understanding the language, he had understood the question. He pointed at the workshop bay where Darrow was, at that moment, lying underneath a Reach-licensed ground transport and diagnosing a brake failure. Darrow heard footsteps. He slid out from under the transport on his creeper, looked up, and saw Rail standing over him with her hands clasped behind her back and her gold-amber eyes looking down at him, with an expression he had had 8 months to theorize about and still couldn't fully decode. He was covered in brake fluid. "Hi," he said. She said something. He still didn't have the translation. He spread his hands in the same gesture he'd used in the ship. "I don't know how to show you," and this time she responded not with a holographic map, but with a device she produced from inside her armor, a small disc, which she held up and then set on the transport beside his head. The disc emitted a soft sound and then said, in English that was slightly clipped but entirely intelligible, "I told you I would return." Darrow sat up. "You did," he said. "I have spent the intervening period requesting that the translation apparatus be completed in order to have this conversation." She paused. The disc seemed to have some processing lag. "The xenolinguists of your government were helpful. Ours were less cooperative. The sovereignty does not typically invest resources in translating the languages of uncontacted species. I had to make a case." "What case did you make?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her hands, the bioluminescent tracery on the backs of them, which were brighter than he remembered, fully lit, moving in their slow currents. "I told them about a human who fixed my ship with a repair method so primitive that our engineers could not determine whether it was an act of extraordinary resourcefulness or an insult. They debated this for 3 months. A pause. They concluded it was resourcefulness. This is a higher assessment than your species has received from any Vethani analysis to date." "That's a low bar," Darrow said. "It is a starting point," she said. "We work with what we have." He became aware, gradually, that the depot had gone very quiet. He looked around. Every person in the building, Chavez, the other mechanics, the delivery driver who had been arguing about a discrepancy in his manifest, was standing still, watching. Outside, through the bay doors, he could see the 4 high-altitude ships still hanging in the early morning sky. He looked back at Rail. "Is this a diplomatic visit?" "It is," she paused. "It is also personal." He had known, or told himself he knew, in the 8 months of theoretical thinking, that when she said, "I'll come back for you," that you might be a general you. The human species, not him specifically. He had been very careful and very logical about constructing that interpretation, because it was the one that made sense across the enormous gap of 30 light-years and 4,000 years of spacefaring civilization. He had not entirely believed it. "You came back for the species," he said. "It was not a question, it was a checkpoint." She looked at him with the gold-amber eyes and said, very clearly in the clipped English of the translation disc, "I came back for the mechanic." The depot was very quiet. Darrow became aware that he was still sitting on the creeper with brake fluid on his hands and a ratchet in one of them, and that behind rail the 4 attendants were standing with expressions that suggested they were vigorously suppressing something. Whether concern or amusement or embarrassment he couldn't tell. "I need to wash my hands," he said. "I am told this is common among your species before important events." "It seems like a good habit in general," he said. "It'll take a minute. Do you want—" He stopped. He tried to figure out how to complete that sentence in a way that wasn't absurd and couldn't. Rael tilted her head. "I have waited 8 months," she said. "A minute is acceptable." He washed his hands at the utility sink, twice, until most of the brake fluid was gone. He looked at himself in the small mirror above the sink. He looked like what he was, a mechanic who had been lying under a vehicle at 7 in the morning, who had not shaved in 3 days, who was going to have a very large and difficult conversation with very many people in the near future about what exactly had happened in the Mojave 8 months ago, and what it meant, and what came next. He dried his hands on a shop rag. He thought about Bradbury, about the levitating path, the rules of non-interference, all the protocols designed to prevent small actions from cascading into enormous ones. He thought about how those rules existed because the people who made them understood, or thought they understood, that cause and effect in complex systems was not linear, that a foot placed wrong could change a world. They weren't wrong, they just had the valence backwards. The thing about a butterfly, he thought, was that its wings created the same pressure regardless of whether it was dead or alive. The question was direction. The question was which way the wind bent. He had placed his foot wrong, by any protocol's accounting. He had entered an exclusion zone on a contractor badge that didn't authorize it. He had opened an alien access seam using a method that no training program had recommended, because no training program had thought of it. He had fixed a gravitational propulsion core with thermal tape and cold coffee. He had held a strange woman's gaze in an amber-lit corridor, and sat with her in the quiet and not performed authority, and not performed threat, and just been what he was, a person who fixed things and talked to them while he did it. He had stepped off the path. And history had changed. Not catastrophically, not in the direction of ruin. The dead butterfly that changed everything was a crushing. His had not been a crushing. His had been something else. A small warmth extended across an impossible distance, the human gesture that the alien had received and carried back across 30 light years and presented to her people as evidence of something they had not previously counted as real. He put the shop rag down. He walked back out into the bay. Rael was standing exactly where he'd left her. Her attendants had maintained their positions with the patient immobility of people accustomed to waiting on royalty. Chavez was still holding his clipboard. Outside, the 4 ships hung in the early morning light like geometries the sky had always contained but never bothered to mention. Darrow stopped in front of her. "I have a lot of questions," he said. "As do I." "That's going to be a long conversation." "Many conversations," she said, "conducted over a period of time that will require significant logistical coordination between our respective governing bodies. There are also protocols to establish, trade agreements to discuss, mutual defense provisions to consider, and a number of formal ceremonies that the sovereignty requires before." "Okay," he said, "but first." She stopped. He crossed the distance between them 4 paces, the same distance she had crossed 8 months ago, and he did what he'd been thinking about for 8 months, which was to put his hand, the one that still had a faint ghost of brake fluid between the knuckles, flat against the center of his chest and then extend it toward her, palm up. An offering, a counterpoint to the forehead press, a human gesture for, "I have registered you as real." She looked at his hand. She put hers over it, large, warm, the bioluminescent tracery bright and moving, and pressed down once gently, and then held it there. The 4 attendants behind her were definitely suppressing something now. From outside in the parking lot, Chavez said, very quietly to no one in particular, "That's going to be one heck of a report." What followed was, and this was recorded in subsequent historical assessments of the period, with language that toggled between extraordinary and procedurally unprecedented, depending on who was writing, the fastest formal first contact process in any recorded diplomatic history. Which was not because it was rushed, but because Rael had apparently spent the 8 months of her absence doing the preparatory work that contact protocols typically required, and had arrived not with a hailing frequency, but with a finished framework. The Vethani sovereignty wanted a relationship with humanity. The reason, which emerged over the following weeks of formal sessions and was eventually published in a form that the general public could access, had several diplomatic layers: trade access, positional advantage relative to other reach-affiliated species, the technological curiosity of a species at a specific developmental stage. The real reason, which circulated in the transcripts, and which anyone who read them carefully could identify, was simpler. She had been alone in a failing ship in an alien desert, and a human being had sat down on the floor of her corridor without announcing himself dramatically, and said, "I'm a mechanic. I'm going to need to look at your engine," and had then spent 4 hours fixing what he could and leaving alone what he couldn't, and talking the whole time in the low, quiet way that people talk to machinery they were trying not to frighten. And she had never, in 34 years of being the second daughter of a Vethani sovereignty house, in the politics and ceremonies and weight of that, in the isolation of command and the loneliness of high station, felt that specifically seen. The Vethani were not a sentimental species. The concept of sentiment, as a valid political driver, would have been rejected at any sovereignty council table. But the concept of accuracy, of identifying the correct nature of a thing, and acting on that identification rather than on assumption, was deeply, structurally Vethani. And what Rael had brought back from the Mojave was a data point so accurate it reorganized everything around it. Humans were stubbornly, specifically, impractically kind, not as a policy, not as a performance, as a reflex, as a noise they made like machinery running right. This was, the council had eventually been persuaded, relevant information. Darrow Voss did not become a diplomat. He did not want to be a diplomat and was not built for it, and said so clearly when it was suggested. And when the suggestion was made a second time by a different department, he said the same thing with more specificity. He was a person who fixed machines and understood machinery by spending time with it quietly, and the quality that made him good at that was not transferable to a conference table. He would be worse at diplomacy than any trained diplomat. He would be worse at it than most untrained ones. He was available to be useful in the way he was actually useful, and not in the other way. The State Department eventually created a position called Xenotechnical Cultural Liaison, which was a title that made no official sense but which described, accurately enough, what he actually did. He went where the friction was. When the Vethani delegation indicated, through the formal translation apparatus, that a particular proposed site for their liaison facility had geomagnetic properties that were offensive to sovereignty navigational tradition, and the State Department's response was to produce 17 pages of counterarguments about why the geomagnetic properties were actually fine. Darrow was the person who sat in a room with the Vethani delegation's technical advisor and spent 3 hours asking questions about navigational tradition until he understood what the actual problem was, which was not the geomagnetic properties at all, but the angular relationship between the site and the nearest water source, which had a specific symbolic valence in Vethani spatial reasoning. Then he went back to the State Department and said, Move it 4 kilometers northeast. They moved it 4 kilometers northeast. He never became comfortable with the weight of what was happening, the sense that every small interaction was load-bearing in a way that human diplomatic history didn't have adequate frameworks for yet. But discomfort, he had found, was not the same as incapacity. You worked with discomfort the same way you worked with a component you didn't entirely understand, carefully, attentively, without forcing. What he became was something that didn't have a formal title yet, something between a technical liaison and a cultural interpreter, which mostly meant that when the very large and very complicated diplomatic apparatus had a problem it couldn't solve because it was approaching the problem from the wrong angle, it called him. He was in the room for most of the formal sessions, usually in the back, usually with something in his hands, a cup of coffee, a small mechanical puzzle, once a section of a secondary thruster component from a Vethani support vessel that had developed a fault and that he was working through while the diplomats argued. Rael noticed him noticing things. That was, he came to understand, gradually, among the things she had come back for. Not just the gesture he had made in the desert, though that was part of it. The attention. The specific quality of attention that went into understanding a thing before deciding what to do about it. She had spent a great deal of her life surrounded by people who had already decided what to do. He had spent a great deal of his life surrounded by things that needed fixing, which had given him the habit of listening first. They were, in their way, calibrated to each other, the way a lock and a key were calibrated, not because one was stronger than the other, but because the shapes fit. The forehead press, he eventually learned, was a Vethani greeting reserved for those you had decided to trust. Not like a handshake, something with considerably more weight than that. It was an acknowledgement that the person in front of you had access to you, could affect you, and you were choosing not to prevent it. She had done it in a broken ship in a desert after he'd spent 40 minutes learning to answer a lock that was trying to tell him how to open it. He thought about that for a long time after he learned what it meant. 6 months after Rael's return, on a morning when the Mojave was burning orange and purple in the early light, and the first Vethani permanent liaison facility was being installed at a site the State Department had chosen, and the sovereignty had approved after considerable back and forth about the appropriate geomagnetic and directional properties of the location, Darrow drove out to the original site. He did not tell anyone he was going. It wasn't a secret. He just didn't feel the need to announce it, the same way he didn't announce when he drove out to the mountains on a Sunday. Some things didn't need a reason beyond themselves. The road to the site was paved now, which it hadn't been when he'd driven out the first time on the fuel cell that kept threatening to quit. The pavement ended 2 kilometers from the site itself, where the installation of the liaison facility had required a new access road that the construction company had built out and the military had repaved. He parked where the pavement ended and walked the rest of the way in the early morning quiet, with the sage on the air and the mountains turning pink on the horizon. The scorch marks were still there. The violet stain in the dust, long dried, still faintly visible, though it had faded over the months from purple to a pale gray mauve, almost indistinguishable from the desert floor unless you knew what you were looking at. The exclusion perimeter markers had been pulled up but left shallow holes in the ground, a perfect circle of small depressions that caught shadow in the low morning sun. The place where he'd sat cross-legged in front of the access panel for 40 minutes, learning to answer the conversation. He sat on the hood of his truck. He drank his coffee. The desert in the early morning had a quality he'd never been able to explain to people who hadn't experienced it, a kind of suspended clarity, the air cool and absolute before the day's heat built, the light coming in flat and gold and defining every stone and shadow with unusual precision. It was a place that did not forgive carelessness and also did not hold grudges. It received whatever happened in it and then went on. He thought about the path, the metaphor, the idea that there was a correct sequence of events, a designated floating walkway above the living ground of cause and effect, and that stepping off it was catastrophe. He thought about how the path was designed to serve a specific outcome, and the outcome was, nothing changes. The future you left from is the future you return to. The way home is identical to the way out. The butterfly lives or it dies, but either way it matters, and the rules exist to keep you from knowing that. The rules existed to make you feel that your choices were contained, were safe, were bounded by a protocol that had thought of everything. He thought about Eccles, not the real man. There was no real man. It was a story, but the character. The hunter who had paid $10,000 to be brave and discovered, at the critical moment, that he'd purchased only the idea of bravery and not the substance of it, who had panicked and stepped off and destroyed everything while trying to flee back to safety, whose catastrophe was not the stepping off precisely, but the running away. The fear. That was not, he thought, actually a good outcome. It was just a predictable one, and there was a difference. What he had done, stepping off every designated path there was, entering the perimeter on a contractor badge that didn't authorize it, talking to a door until it opened, fixing a gravitational core with thermal tape and bad coffee, sitting on an alien corridor floor and offering the most basic, stripped-down version of professional courtesy to someone in distress, had changed things. Irreversibly. The butterfly was crushed and could not be uncrushed, and history was altered and would remain so. But the butterfly had not been crushed. That was the thing. His butterfly had been a small warmth in an amber-lit corridor, freely given to a stranger in a broken ship. It had not been stolen from the timeline. It had been added to it. And the change it had set in motion was still running forward, quietly, along every causal chain it could find, in a world that had not existed 60 million years from now, or 8 months ago, or until a mechanic in the Mojave had sat down on the floor and decided that fixing a thing was more important than the rules about which things you were authorized to fix. The sun came up fully over the mountains. The desert turned gold. Somewhere above him, out of sight, 4 Vethani ships moved in their slow and geometric patterns, tending their own business in the sky above the city that was now, by any measure that mattered, no longer only human. He finished his coffee. He stayed on the hood of the truck for a while after, not doing anything in particular. The sun came fully over the ridge. The desert sharpened into itself. A hawk circled once over the dried violet stain, considered it with the specific calculating attention of a creature that did not invest energy in the inexplicable, and flew on. He thought about the 4 other contractors who had failed to open the access panel. They were not incompetent. One of them had 2 advanced xenotechnical certifications that made his correspondence course look like a weekend hobby. They had failed because they had approached the panel as a lock, and locks were systems you overcame. You applied force or current or the correct key, and the lock yielded to your authority. The panel was not a lock. It was a question, and the reason he had answered it correctly was not because he was more skilled, but because he had spent 11 years in a place where the machinery couldn't be replaced, and therefore had to be listened to, had to be understood on its own terms rather than forced into operating according to yours. The ore processing plant, in its decades of underfunding and delayed maintenance and improvised solutions, had trained him in something the certifications didn't cover: the specific humility of a mechanic who couldn't afford to be wrong about what a thing was trying to tell him. That humility was, he thought, probably the most human thing about him. Not the ingenuity. The Vethani had identified that, and he was glad, but ingenuity was not uniquely human. Any species that survived long enough had to have it. The humility, the particular quality of a creature that was not the strongest or the fastest or the best equipped, and had learned in the long years of its becoming to compensate for that by paying close attention, by listening, by asking the world what it needed rather than declaring what it was going to receive. He thought maybe that was what she had carried back. Not the proof that humans were remarkable. They were remarkable. Most species were remarkable. Remarkability was just what survival looked like from the outside. She had carried back the proof that humans were specific, that there was a texture to the way they moved through problems, a grain in the wood, and you could feel it if you were close enough and still enough. And she had been close enough, in an amber-lit corridor with a broken ship around her, and she had felt it. And across 30 light years, in whatever councils and chambers the Vethani sovereignty conducted its long, careful, aristocratic reckoning with the universe, that specificity had apparently been enough. He drove back to the depot, because there was a Reach-licensed ground transport with a brake issue that he hadn't finished diagnosing, and it wasn't going to fix itself. The forehead press, he had also learned, was not the end of the gesture. It had a second part. The second part came later, weeks later, months later, sometimes years later, when the trust that the first part had declared had been tested and had held. The second part was a low sound, made against the side of the other person's face, in the space just forward of the jaw. It was not a kiss, not exactly. It was closer to a statement. It meant, I have tested this. It is what I said it was. She had done the second part in the ship, before she left. He had spent 8 months convincing himself it was a general farewell. He had not believed it. He was right not to believe it. She was right to do it. There was, it turned out, a translation for those 2 or 3 words she'd said, once the linguists had gotten through enough of the vocabulary to map the relevant phrases. He'd asked. They'd told him. He'd sat with it for a while. The translation, stripped of the formal register and the Vethani syntactic constructions that didn't map directly to English, was approximately, I'll come back for you. He thought about that, in the way you thought about something that had turned out to be exactly what it sounded like. No complicating factors, no hedging required. Then he thought, of course. Of course, because the small acts were the hinges. Of course, because the butterfly that lived flew forward through time. Of course, because a mechanic in a desert with thermal tape and bad coffee, and the specific habit of listening before deciding, had answered a door that was trying to tell him how to open it, and in doing so had opened something that neither of them had known was closed. He smiled at the road ahead. The engine of the truck ran steady and smooth, because he kept it that way. The morning opened. Everything changed, and changed, and changed.